Dust drifted through the main street like it belonged there, settling on hitching posts, wagon wheels, and the low wooden fronts of building that had been patched too many times. Cattle moved slowly behind split-rail fences, ribs showing through hide, tails flicking at flies that never left. A saloon leaned slightly to one side, its swinging doors creaking even when no one passed through. Near it, the stables smelled of hay, sweat, and old leather, the sound of horses shifting and snorting constant, familiar and ignored. This was a border town, half-built, half-worn down, caught between survival and collapse. People came here to work, to trade, to disappear. No one came to be seen. At the far edge of it all, where the buildings thinned and the land turned rough again, stood a small, rough wooden shelter. Not quite a house, barely more than 4 walls and a roof pulled together from scavenged boards. That was where Lena Greywolf lived. Her shelter sat apart from the others on purpose. Not because she asked for distance, but because distance was given to her, whether she wanted it or not. Wind reached her first. Cold stayed longer. When rain came, it found the cracks in her walls easily, slipping inside without asking. Lena woke before the town stirred. She washed other people's clothes in cold water, her hands red and raw by morning, scrubbing dirt and sweat from fabric that would never truly come clean. She didn't complain. She folded each piece carefully and left it where she'd been told, never stepping too close, never waiting to be thanked. When there was hay to be cut, she worked under the open sky, gathering dry grass into tight bundles, lifting and stacking until her shoulders burned. The sun pressed down hard in the afternoon, but she kept moving, measured and steady. She carried water to the stables when the troughs ran low, bucket by bucket, step by step. The horses noticed her more than the people did. They lifted their heads when she approached. Some leaned closer. She spoke to them softly, not to soothe them, but because silence felt heavier when it was forced. No one in town struck her. That much was true, but no one truly looked at her either. Eyes passed over her like she was part of the background, like the fence posts, the dust, the long road stretching out past the last building. When she entered a space, conversations didn't stop. They simply adjusted, closing around her absence. Lena had learned how to move without drawing attention, how to step aside before someone told her to, how to lower her gaze so it wouldn't challenge, wouldn't ask questions that had no answers. She kept her head down, not from fear, but from habit. A habit built over time, shaped by knowing when a voice would not be welcome. She was not fragile. Her hands were strong from work, her back straight from carrying weight, her steps sure on uneven ground. But strength did not mean permission, and in this town, permission was everything. The saloon doors swung open and shut all day long. Laughter spilled out. Anger followed it sometimes. Lena passed by without slowing, the sound sliding off her like rain off dry earth. At the stables, men talked over her, around her, through her. Instructions were short. Payment was exact. No extra words wasted. That was the rule. Do the work, take what's given, leave quietly. Lena followed it because she understood something others did not say out loud. Survival here depended on knowing when silence was safer than truth. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the dusk glowed gold for a brief moment, she returned to her shelter. She mended what she could, ate simply, listened to the town settle into itself, the clink of bottles, the low murmur of voices, the restless shifting of animals. She did not dream of leaving. She did not dream of changing things. She lived one day at a time, measured and contained, like water poured carefully so none would spill. From the very beginning, it was clear to anyone willing to look closely, Lena Greywolf was not weak. She was quiet because she had learned that in this town, her voice was not something people were ready to hear. The afternoon heat hung low and heavy, the kind that pressed down on the back of the neck and slowed every step. Lena Greywolf was walking past the far edge of town, where the noise thinned and the land opened up again, when she noticed something that hadn't been there before. At first, she thought it was a bundle of rags left behind. It was sitting near the dry grass beyond the last line of buildings, close to where hay was sometimes stacked before being hauled away. The shape was wrong, though. Too upright, too still. The longer Lena looked, the clearer it became. It was a woman, an old one. She sat on the ground with her back slightly bent, hands resting loosely in her lap. Her clothes were filthy, stained by dust and time. layers that might once have been respectable, but now hung off her frame like they'd forgotten their purpose. Gray hair slipped loose around her face, uncombed, caught in the wind. Her eyes were open, empty. They didn't follow movement, didn't flinch when flies landed near them. They stared ahead, unfocused, as if the world had stepped too far away for her to reach it. The woman didn't speak. She didn't beg. She didn't even look hungry in the way people usually did. No reaching hands, no desperate glances. She simply existed there, unmoving, like something the town had overlooked and forgotten to finish dealing with. Lena slowed her steps, not out of fear, out of recognition. She had seen people like this before. Not many, but enough to know what it meant when someone sat that still. When a body remained, but the will seemed to have drifted elsewhere. A wagon rattled past on the road behind her. No one stopped. No one turned their head. Later, Lena would hear the names people used when they spoke about the woman at all. Just some old crazy woman. A burden. She wandered in and never left. That was the full explanation the town offered. Short, convenient, final. No one asked where she had come from. No one asked who she belonged to. Questions like that required responsibility, and responsibility was something people avoided when it didn't serve them. Lena did not ask either. She didn't kneel down to demand answers or reach out to touch the woman's arm. She didn't try to wake her from whatever quiet place she had retreated into. Instead, Lena set her bundle down. She took out a small bowl, worn smooth from use, and filled it with water from the jug she carried. She placed it on the ground close enough that the woman could reach it without effort. Then she broke off a piece of dry bread, hard, simple, the kind meant to last, and laid it beside the bowl. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead. Her hands did not move. Lena waited only a moment longer, just long enough to be sure the bowl wouldn't tip over in the wind. Then she stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and walked away. It was an ordinary thing to do. Anyone could have done it, but no one else had. As Lena returned toward her shelter, the town continued as it always did. The saloon doors creaked, horses stamped in their stalls, voices carried on without pause. Life moved forward without acknowledging what sat just beyond its edge. By the time the sun began to lower, shadows stretching long across the ground, the woman was still there. So was the bowl, so was the bread. No one claimed them. That night, Lena lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind slide through the cracks in her walls. She did not replay the woman's face in her mind. She did not wonder about her past. Wondering led to questions, and questions led to trouble. What mattered was simpler than that. There had been a person sitting alone, and now there had been water within reach. In a town built on hard ground and harder rules, it was the smallest act possible, something easily overlooked, something that could be dismissed as nothing at all. But that quiet moment, the bowl placed on the dirt, the bread left without demand, would not remain small for long. It was the beginning of something the town was not ready to see. And once set in motion, it would not stop. Caleb Hart's ranch stretched farther than most men could walk in a day. Fences cut across the land in long, deliberate lines, marking ownership the way scars mark skin. Cattle grazed under an unforgiving sky, watched over by hired hands who knew the rules well enough not to question them. Horses were kept strong, rifles clean, accounts balanced down to the last figure. Everything had its place, and Caleb Hart made sure of it. He was a man shaped by order and pressure, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, the kind who stood still and made others move around him. His word carried weight because it had been tested, by drought, by debt, by men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. He had learned early that hesitation cost more than bullets. On his land, nothing drifted without purpose. Nothing, that is, except what waited inside the main house. The house itself was solid, built from thick timber, standing slightly apart from the barns and corrals. It was meant to be a place of rest, a stronghold against the harshness of the plains. Lately, it felt hollow. Evelyn Hart was gone. Not dead, at least not officially. Just gone. Her room stood untouched, her chair empty, her presence reduced to silence that no one knew how to fill. She had once been the steady center of the household, a quiet force who did not raise her voice, but never needed to. Now her absence moved through the house like a cold draft. Ruth Hart did not linger over it. Caleb's mother spoke of Evelyn as though she had already crossed some invisible line, past usefulness, past relevance. She wandered off, Ruth said flatly. People like that do. Her search efforts matched her tone. A few questions asked, a few men sent out for a short while. Enough to say something had been done. Not enough to mean it. Caleb watched this from a distance he did not name. He ordered riders out beyond the ranch. He questioned hands who worked the edges of town. He paid attention to schedules, to routes, to what should have been noticed sooner. He did not sit in Evelyn's room. He did not ask what she had been thinking before she left. Caleb told himself he was being practical. The ranch still needed running. People still depended on him. Land didn't pause for grief. That was the truth he lived by. But responsibility, when stripped of understanding, became something hollow, a task instead of a connection. Ruth never said it aloud, but the message was clear enough. Evelyn had become a problem long before she disappeared. Forgetful, quiet, slow. The kind of burden that disrupted efficiency. Ruth believed in forward motion. Anything that lagged behind was to be left there. Caleb did not argue. Not because he agreed, but because arguing required time. And time was the one thing he never allowed himself. He searched because it was expected. Because a man in his position could not afford the appearance of indifference. Because order demanded a response. But nowhere in his thinking did he ask what Evelyn needed. That question would have required him to stop. And stopping was dangerous. The house felt different without her. Louder somehow, even in silence. The meals were shorter, conversations sharper. Ruth filled the space with instructions and criticism, keeping everything tightly wound. Caleb noticed it all and filed it away. The same way he handled everything else, with control, with distance. Yet something beneath that structure had begun to fracture. It showed in the way Ruth dismissed concern too quickly. In the way Caleb's searches grew narrower instead of wider. In the way no one seemed willing to admit that something essential had already been lost long before Evelyn disappeared from sight. Out on the land, the ranch ran smoothly. Inside the Hart family, something was quietly coming apart. And though Caleb Hart owned more than most men ever would, acres of land, livestock, authority, there was one thing he could not command. Time. Time to notice what had been slipping away. Time to understand that loss did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it simply stood up and walked out, while everyone else was too busy managing what remained. Lena Greywolf returned the next day. The sun was already high, burning away the morning chill, when she walked past the edge of town toward the stretch of dry grass where the woman sat. Nothing had changed. The land looked the same, flat, unforgiving, quiet in a way that made every sound carry farther than it should. Evelyn Hart was still there. She sat in the same position, her body angled slightly forward, hands resting where Lena had left them the day before. The bowl was gone. The bread, too. Lena did not know whether Evelyn had touched them or if someone passing through had taken them away. She did not ask the question out loud, even to herself. She set down another bowl. Water first, always water. Then food. Lena did not kneel to Evelyn's level. She did not hover or speak in a tone meant to soften reality. She placed what was needed within reach and stepped back, giving space without abandoning the moment. No instructions. No urging. She pulled a piece of cloth from her bundle and rigged it loosely between two broken fence posts, enough to throw shade where there had been none. The sun was merciless in the afternoon, and Lena understood how quickly it wore people down. Evelyn did not look at her. Her eyes remained distant, unfocused, as though the world in front of her was only a shadow of something that had already passed. Lena stayed anyway. She sat nearby, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to disappear. Her presence was quiet and steady, like a marker placed in the ground. When the wind shifted, Lena adjusted the cloth. When dust kicked up, she shielded the bowl. She did not speak. And then she left. The next day she came again, and the next. Each time the same routine, the same patience. Lena never brought more than she could carry, never brought questions that would demand answers Evelyn could not give. She did not ask where Evelyn came from. She did not ask why she had been left there. Those questions belonged to a world that had already failed this woman. On the third day, Lena noticed something different. The food was gone. Not scattered, not taken by animals. Gone in the way that meant someone had eaten it. Lena felt the shift but did not react outwardly. She placed fresh bread down anyway, along with water, and sat in her usual place. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly when they moved. Slow, careful, as if each motion required permission. She ate without lifting her head, breaking the bread into small pieces, chewing longer than necessary. There was no hurry in it, no hunger-driven urgency, just effort. Lena remained still. She did not watch too closely. She understood the weight of being observed. By the end of the week, the change was unmistakable. Evelyn sat straighter. Her eyes, once vacant, now followed the bowl when Lena set it down. Sometimes they drifted toward Lena herself, not with recognition, but with awareness. That was enough. There were no words exchanged, no shared history uncovered, no moment of sudden clarity. Healing, Lena knew, was not a dramatic thing. It happened quietly, in small allowances, in the absence of pressure. Each day, Lena offered the same thing: food, shade, and a presence that asked for nothing in return. And each day, Evelyn responded, not to speech, not to explanation, but to the simple fact that someone returned. The town did not notice at first. It rarely noticed things that took time. But something had shifted out there beyond the last buildings. In that patch of dry land most people avoided, something fragile had begun to steady itself. Evelyn Hart did not react to kindness spoken aloud. She reacted to constancy, to the certainty that when the sun rose, someone would come. And that, more than any question or command, was what slowly called her back. In a town like this, nothing stayed quiet for long. Word traveled the way dust did, carried by passing feet, clinging to whatever it touched, settling where it was least welcome. It didn't need proof. It only needed repetition. Martha Pike was the first to give the whispers a shape. From behind the counter of her dry goods store, she leaned close to customers and lowered her voice just enough to sound concerned. "That Apache girl," she said, eyes narrowing, "the one at the edge of town. She's been hanging around that old woman, every day." The words "hanging around" did the work for her. By the next afternoon, the story had grown sharper. Less observation, more accusation. People began to say Lena Greywolf was attached to the old woman, that she was watching her, that she might be waiting for something. No one asked what. They never did. Hank Dobbs heard the talk before it reached the ranch. He had been around long enough to recognize the pattern. Trouble didn't announce itself. It hinted, gathered shape, then struck once people felt justified. Hank rode out to see Caleb Hart under the pretense of checking fences. When they stood apart from the others, Hank spoke low and direct. "Folks are noticing things," he said. "That girl, the Apache, she's been seen with the old woman more than once." Caleb's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. Hank went on. "I don't know what she's after, but people are talking. You might want to keep an eye on it." It wasn't concern that drove Hank. It was caution. In towns like this, suspicion had a way of becoming action. Caleb listened. He nodded once, that was all. Out by the stables, Eli Turner and Silas Boone had noticed the change long before the rumors reached them. They had seen Evelyn Hart sitting straighter, had seen her take food with her own hands, had seen her eyes track movement again, slow but present. Eli mentioned it once quietly. "She's doing better," he said. Silas shook his head. "Don't say that too loud." Both men understood the risk of being wrong. Or worse, being right when the town had already chosen a different story. So they stayed silent. Silence was safer than contradiction. Wade Colson heard the rumors too. As sheriff, he had learned that stories often arrived before trouble did. He didn't chase them, but he didn't ignore them either. He made a note, kept an eye on the edge of town, told himself he'd step in if things went sideways. If there was a problem, the town didn't need facts to reach that point. It only needed a target, and Lena Greywolf stood out without trying. She walked the same paths, carried the same water, kept her head down as always. But now eyes followed her longer than they used to. Conversations shifted when she passed. No one asked her what she was doing. They had already decided what it meant. What none of them talked about was the old woman herself. Evelyn Hart was still there, still alive, still changing in small, undeniable ways. But acknowledging that would have meant acknowledging that neglect, not danger, had been the real threat. And that was harder to face. It was easier to believe in intention, easier to believe in wrongdoing, easier to believe that something was being done rather than something being ignored. The town didn't want the truth. It wanted balance restored. And in places like this, balance was often achieved by placing blame on the person least able to defend themselves. Lena kept coming back each day, unaware of how the air around her had shifted. Or perhaps she knew and came anyway. By the time the first looks turned openly hostile, the story had already settled into place. All it needed now was a reason to be acted upon. Caleb Hart did not intend to find them that way. He had ridden out earlier than usual, following the uneasy weight Hank Dobbs' warning had left behind. The edge of town lay quiet under the late morning sun, the kind of quiet that made small sounds carry too far. Hooves slowed as Caleb drew closer to the patch of dry grass behind the last buildings. That was when he saw them. An old woman sat on the ground, shaded by a makeshift stretch of cloth tied between broken posts. A bowl rested nearby. So did a piece of bread. Beside her, seated just far enough away to give space, was a young woman with her head slightly lowered. Lena Greywolf. Caleb's first reaction was sharp and immediate. Anger rose before reason had a chance to catch up. This was his grandmother, his responsibility. And here she was, sitting out in the open, attended by someone the town barely acknowledged, someone others were already whispering about. Caleb dismounted with a force that made his horse snort. The sound carried. Lena looked up then, meeting his gaze only briefly before lowering her eyes again. "What do you think you're doing?" Caleb demanded. His voice cut through the stillness, hard and controlled, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. Lena did not answer. Her silence only fueled his suspicion. To him, it looked calculated, like avoidance, like guilt. Before he could say more, another voice cut in, sharp, impatient, unmistakably offended. Ruth Hart stepped forward, her posture stiff with authority and outrage. She had followed Caleb at a distance, determined to see the situation dealt with properly. "So this is it," Ruth said, eyes raking over Lena with open contempt. "I knew it." She didn't wait for explanation. She never did. "You think you can sit here and play caretaker?" Ruth snapped. "Using my mother like this? Get up!" She pointed away from Evelyn, her finger trembling not with fear but fury. "Leave, now!" Lena remained where she was. She did not speak. She did not argue. She did not look to Caleb for protection. But she did not move. Ruth's voice rose. "Did you hear me? You don't belong here." Still, Lena stayed. Caleb watched, caught between irritation and something he did not yet recognize. The girl showed no defiance in her posture, no challenge, no bravado. Only a quiet resolve that unsettled him more than resistance would have. "This is private land," Caleb said, colder now. "You need to go." Lena's hands rested loosely at her sides. Her breathing was steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, even. "She's not ready." That was all. Ruth let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Not ready for what? Being dragged out of the dirt by some Apache girl who thinks she knows better?" She stepped forward, reaching for Evelyn's arm. The movement was sudden. Evelyn reacted just as quickly. Her fingers tightened, not around Ruth's sleeve, not around Caleb's coat, but around Lena's wrist. The grip was desperate, stronger than anyone expected. "No," Evelyn said. The word came out broken, strained, but unmistakable. The world seemed to pause. Ruth froze mid-motion, shock flashing across her face. Caleb stared, his anger faltering as his mind struggled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Evelyn's hand did not let go. Her other arm drew inward, pulling closer to Lena, her body turning away from Ruth as if guided by instinct alone. For the first time since Caleb had arrived, he truly looked at his grandmother. She was not vacant. She was afraid, and she was choosing. Lena did not move. She did not comfort or reassure. She simply remained exactly where she was, allowing Evelyn to decide for herself. The moment stretched, fragile and undeniable. Ruth pulled her hand back slowly, her expression hardening as embarrassment replaced authority. "This is ridiculous," she said, though the certainty had drained from her voice. Caleb said nothing. Something fundamental had shifted. What he thought he understood about control, about responsibility, about who belonged where, no longer fit the scene in front of him. Evelyn had not responded to commands. She had not responded to family. She had responded to presence. And standing there watching his grandmother cling to a girl he had been prepared to dismiss as a threat, Caleb Hart realized that whatever this situation was, it was no longer something he could simply order away. This moment would not be undone, and nothing that followed would be the same. Caleb Hart did not speak for a long time after that day. He left the edge of town with his thoughts unsettled, carrying with him the image of Evelyn's hand locked around Lena Greywolf's wrist. It stayed with him through the long ride back to the ranch, through the routine of work that usually steadied his mind. But nothing felt steady anymore. He began to watch, not from a distance meant to control, but from one meant to understand. Each morning, Caleb found excuses to ride past the far edge of town. He did not announce himself. He did not interfere. He stayed far enough away to remain unseen, close enough to notice what others had ignored. Lena arrived at the same time every day. She carried the same simple things: water, bread, a cloth for shade. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. There was no ceremony in her movements, no attempt to draw attention. When Lena was there, Evelyn ate, slowly, carefully, as if each bite required effort and choice. Her hands shook, but they worked. Her eyes followed Lena's movements with quiet awareness. When Lena left, Evelyn stopped. The food remained untouched. The bowl stayed full. Caleb saw it more than once. Saw it often enough that denial was no longer an option. What unsettled him more was what happened when family came near. Ruth visited once, her presence stiff and impatient. She spoke loudly, too quickly, as if volume might bridge the distance Evelyn had created. Evelyn did not look at her. Her body tightened. Her hands pulled inward, guarding what little ground she had reclaimed. Caleb tried himself. He approached carefully, knelt at a distance he thought was respectful. He spoke Evelyn's name. He asked questions that felt appropriate, reasonable, necessary. Evelyn's eyes passed over him, not unkindly, just without recognition. The realization landed hard. It wasn't that Evelyn couldn't respond. It was that she wouldn't. Not to pressure, not to expectation, not to voices that demanded instead of waited. Caleb returned to the house that night and sat alone in the dim light. He thought of all the times efficiency had guided his decisions, of all the moments when speed had mattered more than patience. He had been managing a problem. Lena had been honoring a person. The difference was stark and uncomfortable. Ruth, meanwhile, grew sharper. Her frustration surfaced in cutting remarks, in the way she spoke of Evelyn as though she were already gone. "She's wasting away," Ruth said one evening. "That girl is encouraging it." Caleb looked up then. "No," he said. The word surprised them both. Ruth stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face. "Excuse me." Caleb stood. His voice was steady, but there was a new weight behind it. "She eats when the girl is there. She doesn't when we are?" Ruth scoffed. "So we let some Apache decide what's best for my mother?" Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "What's best," he said, "is whatever keeps her here." Ruth's mouth tightened. "You're choosing a stranger over your own family." Caleb held her gaze. "I'm choosing to see what's actually happening." Silence settled between them, heavy and final. For the first time, Caleb understood the depth of the divide. Ruth's concern had never been about Evelyn's comfort. It had been about control, about appearances, about removing inconvenience. And Caleb had allowed it until now. Standing there, he felt the shift fully take hold. Evelyn did not need to be managed. She did not need to be pushed, corrected, or handled like a task undone. She needed space, dignity, the freedom to move at her own pace without being pulled back by expectation. She needed respect. Caleb turned away from his mother and toward something unfamiliar, uncertain, slower, harder. But it was the first direction that had ever felt honest. And once he saw the truth for what it was, there was no turning away from it again. Ruth Hart did not argue anymore. She moved past argument and into action. In a town like this, power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it worked through suggestions, through raised eyebrows and carefully chosen words. Ruth spoke to the right people at the right moments. She framed her concern as responsibility, as order, as safety. "That girl doesn't belong here," she said. "People are getting uneasy." Uneasy was enough. By the next morning, Wade Colson rode out toward the edge of town. He didn't come angry. He didn't come with threats. His presence alone carried weight. The badge, the horse, the quiet authority of someone expected to keep things from turning ugly. Lena Greywolf saw him before he reached her. She understood what it meant. Wade spoke plainly. "You're causing talk," he said. "Might be best if you move on before it turns into something else." Lena listened. She nodded once. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain what she'd done or why she'd done it. Those explanations had never helped people like her. That evening, she packed what little she owned. The bowl, the cloth, a small bundle of bread wrapped tight. She returned one last time to the patch of dry ground behind town. Evelyn Hart sat where she always did. Lena set the water down, set the bread beside it. She adjusted the shade without thinking, hands moving from habit more than intention. She did not sit. She stood there a moment longer than usual, eyes lowered, breathing steady. "I won't be back," she said quietly. "Not to the town, not to anyone else, just to Evelyn." Then she turned to leave. The sound came behind her, soft, strained, unmistakable. "Wait." Lena froze. It was not loud, it was not strong, but it was a voice that had been silent far too long. Evelyn was standing. Her legs trembled beneath her, unsteady and thin, but she was upright. One hand gripped the fence post for balance. The other reached forward, fingers extended as if searching for something solid in the air. "Don't," Evelyn said. The word broke halfway through, breath-catching, but the meaning was clear. The world seemed to stop. Wade Colson shifted in his saddle, stunned. Martha Pike, who had followed at a cautious distance, went silent. Men who had gathered nearby stared openly, unsure of what they were seeing. Caleb Hart stepped forward without thinking. His grandmother stood there, truly stood, for the first time anyone could remember. Her eyes were fixed not on him, not on Ruth, not on the town. They were fixed on Lena. "She stayed," Evelyn continued, each word costing her effort. "She stayed." No one spoke. Ruth's face drained of color. "Mother," she said sharply, trying to step in, trying to reclaim control. Caleb raised a hand. "Enough," he said. His voice carried across the space, calm and final. He turned to Wade first. "She's not going anywhere." Wade hesitated, then nodded once. The badge didn't argue with the truth when it stood in front of him. Caleb faced the others. "Lena Greywolf stays," he said. "Not because I allow it, not because anyone pities her." He gestured toward Evelyn, who was still standing, still holding herself upright through sheer will. "She stays because she's the reason my grandmother is alive." The words landed hard. This wasn't charity, this wasn't mercy. It was acknowledgement. Caleb moved closer to Lena, not to shield her with his body, but to stand beside her, equal ground. "She did what none of us did," he continued. "She showed up every day. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't take anything." Silence stretched across the edge of town. No one challenged him. Ruth said nothing. For once, she had no words that could bend the moment back into her control. Lena remained still, eyes lowered, her presence unchanged. She had not asked to be protected, but protection had come anyway, quietly. And from that moment on, the town understood something it could no longer undo. Whatever Lena Greywolf was to them before, invisible, expendable, easy to blame, she was no longer alone. And neither was Evelyn Hart. The change did not arrive with celebration. There were no announcements, no agreements signed, no clear moment anyone could point to and say this is when it all became different. It happened the way real change always did in places like this, quietly, in small adjustments that could not be taken back once made. Lena Greywolf no longer slept at the edge of town. Caleb had arranged for a small cabin to be cleared near the outer stretch of the ranch, close enough that she could come and go without drawing attention, far enough that it did not feel like a favor being watched. It wasn't presented as protection. It was offered as practicality. Lena accepted without ceremony. She moved what little she owned in a single trip. The same bowl, the same cloth, the same steady silence. She did not thank Caleb, not because she was ungrateful, but because gratitude implied debt. And that was not what this was. Evelyn Hart noticed immediately. She did not speak much. Not yet. But she sat closer to the window now. She waited in ways she hadn't before. When Lena arrived, her shoulders eased, the tension loosening as if her body recognized safety before her mind could name it. Caleb began to change too. Not in ways that were obvious at first. He still rode the land, still gave orders, still managed the ranch with the same sharp efficiency. But there were pauses now, moments where he stopped instead of pushed forward. He learned how to sit, not at the head of a table, not in command, but nearby, quiet, allowing time to move at its own pace. He watched Lena with Evelyn, not intruding, not studying like a problem to solve, just observing the rhythm between them, the way Lena waited, the way Evelyn responded without being prompted. Caleb said less, listened more. When Maya Greywolf arrived, there was no tension. She came as family, not spectacle. She checked on Lena the way people who share history do, with brief words, practical concern, and an understanding that did not need explaining. She stayed long enough to be useful, not long enough to be noticed. Jonah Redbear came with her once. He spoke to Caleb plainly, without reverence or challenge. They stood a distance apart, two men shaped by different worlds, finding common ground in shared responsibility rather than belief. There were no rituals, no ceremonies, no claims of destiny. What passed between them were stories, short ones, lessons remembered, warnings about pride, about forgetting the cost of endurance. When Jonah mentioned the old spirits, it was not as something watching or guiding or interfering. It was memory, history, a way of naming the values that survived long after voices were gone. Respect, patience, accountability. Nothing more. Nothing less. The ranch hands noticed the changes before they named them. Eli Turner spoke more freely now. Silas Boone lingered longer near the house. Even the land seemed to settle, as if responding to the steadier pace. The town watched from a distance. Some resented it, some accepted it. Most adjusted, because life moved on whether they approved or not. What mattered was that things had shifted beyond reversal. Lena belonged, not because she was claimed, but because she had never left when leaving would have been easier. Caleb understood that now. He understood that control had its limits, that strength was not always loud, that presence, given freely and without demand, could change the course of lives more effectively than force ever could. These were small lessons, quiet ones, but they held. And by the time the dust settled into this new shape, no one could remember how the ranch, or the people on it, had ever existed without them. Evelyn Hart grew stronger in ways no one could measure with numbers. She did not wake one morning restored, nor did she return to who she had once been. Healing came unevenly. Some days her steps were sure. Other days she needed the chair pulled closer, the path cleared of small obstacles. But she ate now. She slept. She spoke when she chose to, in brief sentences that carried more weight than long speeches ever could. Most of all, she stayed. She sat by the window in the afternoons and watched the land stretch out under the sun. When Lena Greywolf entered the room, Evelyn's shoulders eased, a small, honest signal that could not be forced. There was no ceremony to it, no gratitude performed, just recognition. Ruth Hart noticed the change and resented it. Control had slipped from her hands without announcement. Decisions were made without her approval. Conversations ended when she tried to steer them. She spoke sharply, then quieter, then not at all. The house no longer bent itself around her expectations. Ruth had believed authority could be maintained through pressure. She was wrong. The town noticed too, though it took longer. People watched Lena pass through the market without flinching looks. They noticed she was no longer asked to step aside, that men tipped their hats without thinking about it, that the stories changed tone, softened at the edges. No one apologized. They didn't need to. Acceptance arrived the way it always did in the West, without ceremony, without confession, carried by habit more than belief. Lena had stayed when it would have been easier to leave. That was something people here understood. Caleb Hart changed last. Not outwardly, not in ways that could be named quickly. He still ran the ranch, still enforced boundaries, still held the weight of responsibility without complaint. But something fundamental had shifted in him, an understanding that could not be undone once seen. He had believed land was the hardest thing to keep. He had been wrong. Standing in the quiet of the evening, watching Evelyn sit with Lena nearby, Caleb understood what ownership did not grant. Land responded to fences and force. People did not. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered. He thought of all the acres he managed, all the disputes he had settled with authority alone. None of that had taught him how to sit still when stillness was required, how to wait without demanding progress, how to recognize dignity where no performance was offered. Lena had taught him that without teaching. This was not a story with a clean ending. There was no promise that Evelyn would fully return, no guarantee that the town would always choose kindness, no certainty that old habits wouldn't try to resurface. But there was something stronger than certainty. There was choice. Each day Lena chose to show up, not as a sacrifice, not as a debt, as presence. Each day, Caleb chose to slow down when everything in him wanted to move faster, to listen when silence offered more truth than words. Each day, Evelyn chose to remain in the world on her own terms. This was not the family any of them had been born into. It was not built by blood alone or sealed by tradition. It did not rely on promises made once and forgotten later. It was built by responsibility taken seriously, by space given freely, by the quiet work of staying. At dusk, the ranch settled into its familiar rhythm. Horses shifted in their stalls. The wind moved through tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed gently. Lena stood on the porch, the sky wide and open before her. Caleb joined her without speaking. They watched the light fade, neither reaching for more than the moment offered. Behind them, Evelyn rested. The world had not softened, but something within it had found its footing.